Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. It's great to be with you again. I feel that we haven't been together now for a while. I don't know why. Probably because I've been traveling. And next week, I will yet again hit the road. I'll be speaking at Future Food Tech in Chicago. Now, Chicago, my hometown, where I spend the bulk of my time still, always been a food capital. Used to be slaughterhouse capital of the world. Sadly, they would ship in the animals, slaughter them, and then train out, ship. When I say ship out, I really mean train out, motor out the animals after slaughter from the central city of Chicago for the United States. But it was also the birthplace of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, where in fact, he did speak about animal welfare issues and human rights issues, what it's like to work in a slaughterhouse, what that does to the communities around it. This was in 1904, producing a huge uprise and bringing really the conditions of animal factories to the forefront of people's thinking. It's also been a big food hub. You think of Kraft, Sara Lee, Heinz, Quaker Oats, and so many, Ingredion, ADM, and so many of the ingredient supply chain companies there as well. So a long time food headquarters, does a lot of growing the breadbasket of the world, if you will, or at least the United States. A lot of growing is happening in Illinois. So it only makes sense that there has been, I think, 5 conferences in the last 4 months in Chicago. There's the National Restaurant Association in July. There'll be the Innovative Food Conference in June. There'll be Future Food Tech. In April, there was a Future Protein Production. So lots going on, plus some venture capital meetings. Okay, so lots going on in Chicago. I hope that you will join me there. Then, as always, I do both the food conferences and the investment conferences. So I'll be speaking at the US SIF Sustainable Investment Forum in Chicago as well. That's all taking place in June. So hopefully to see you there. I want to quickly, before I bring on today's guest, tell everyone, and I'm going to put this in the comments after I'm live. There's been a great article done called Bull in the Climate Shop by Friends of the Earth and a partner, Profundo, a partner in research with them. They have come, and hopefully I can show you my screen. They have come up with a very interesting paper that 3 of the largest banks, Bank of America, Citigroup, and JP Morgan, hopefully you can all see this, make it a little bit larger on my screen, are funding the majority of animal agriculture, big chunk of it. And this represents about 25% of their investment portfolio through loans, et cetera. So not very much. But this little 20.25%, a quarter of 1%, 0.25, this little bit of a rounding error leads to 11% of their entire portfolio emissions. 11% of their CO2 emissions comes from just 0.25 of their investments. Now, that investment number is a rounding error, 0.25, but it causes such damage. This couldn't be in the interest of their shareholders. What sense does it make to finance so much destruction for very little operational gain? I put the question to Bank of America, Citigroup, and JP Morgan Chase. So happy that Friends of the Earth has brought this to our attention. This link is going to be in the notes for the podcast on iTunes, which you should share, as well as on our live LinkedIn. So if you're curious about this, go ahead and read the very interesting article, Bull in the Climate Shop, by Friends of the Earth and their research partner. Okie dokie, getting back to our today's live conversation. I'm so excited to dive deep into precision fermentation. What is it? When will it really be at scale? Come on, we talk about it a lot. When will it really happen in the marketplace? I'd like to bring on the CEO of Triplebar. And if you haven't heard of Triplebar, you certainly will know it deeply and well by the end of today's conversation. Maria Cho, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me, Elizabeth. I'm looking forward to it.
So let's just dive in straight away. Maybe you can help us understand what exactly is precision fermentation and what role does Triplebar play in making it a scalable product in the marketplace?
Yeah, so precision fermentation is a tool that we use in biology to create products for human health and nutrition. And it's a way that we use microorganisms to go through a process called fermentation. It's kind of like how you make beer or other types of fermented foods. But what we do is we take that organism, and then that organism actually makes a protein or a peptide or some type of nutrition component that helps with human nutrition. And so precision fermentation is used in a lot of other applications like enzymes and things, but particularly Triple Bar is focused on the use of fermentation to make food proteins for consumption by people. And so what's interesting, Triple Bar, so for the three bars is the mathematical symbol for identical. And so what we're doing is we're making proteins that are identical to those found in nature, but with much less environmental impact, obviously, but have the same kind of benefits of the products that we've been used to consuming throughout our lives. That's a bit about fermentation and Triple Bar. So
That's great. Let me dive a little bit deeper into that because I just think it's so interesting. Thank you for that note on Triple Bar. It's been a
yeah.
while since I've been in a science class, and that's a great explanation. Um, just for the layman's terms, would it be correct to say that out of, I guess you could take it from an animal, but now there's so many scientific databases, you just get, let's say, a gene, the
Mhm,
gene that, let's say, makes casein, the gene in the animal that makes casein, maybe you get that from a scientific database.
mhm.
And then, for lack of a better expression, and please correct me here if my layman's terms are too simple, you take that gene and you feed it sugar and microbes, and I don't know, you can explain it to me maybe. And then from there, you grow that casein in a controlled environment outside of the animal, and you get all the casein that you would want, and casein being a critical element in, let's say, making cheese. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's close. So I think the maybe additional layer of detail there, and good job for not being like a deep scientist. I think that's great. So you do take the gene of that particular protein, and what you do is you incorporate that into the genome of a microorganism. So this could be a yeast cell or a bacteria cell or a fungus cell, and these cells have become they're industrial workhorses, as we call them. So these types of cells have been used to make lots of products that we are exposed to and consume every single day. And so they're safe. They're called safe organisms to use. So we put that gene in there, and then what we do is we focus on the either the understanding or the lack thereof of metabolism. So how a cell makes the proteins that are inside of it. And what we do with precision fermentation is we try to increase the amount of that protein that that cell would either secrete or create inside of it, and then we would go inside the cell and then isolate that particular protein. And so you want to make a lot of it. You want these organisms to be able to produce a lot of it, and that process about increasing what we call titer, or the amount of that protein that that cell is making, that is part of the process that scientists have been working on for quite some time. And this is where Triple Bar has a specific edge to actually increase that amount of protein that those cells can make, and also have it be the same type of protein that we've seen and have been using on the market today. Yeah, go
So
ahead.
many questions. First of
Yeah,
all, just a little bit again from the non-scientific standpoint. Hopefully, this is helpful for the non-scientific listeners
yeah.
today. Microorganisms; these are living things that are neither plant nor animal. Correct?
That's right. They're single cell organisms. Yep.
Single cell organisms. And as you say, they have been vetted, for lack of a better expression, already considered safe and in use. Can you give me some examples of these organisms maybe that we already have in our daily lives and don't know it?
Yeah, so you can think about maybe a simple example is like the probiotics or like bacteria that you have
Yeah.
in yogurt. So there's a particular strain of that bacteria that we use in yogurt that we use in fermentation. We also use things like to make beer. So you know how when you ferment beer, there's a yeast organism, so it's called Saccharomyces. Again, I don't want to get too scientific, but basically those are used to ferment the beer and release the alcohol components within the beer. And so those are just a couple examples. It's also used to make cheeses, so you have to do fermentation when you make cheese. And so these organisms are usually used in that kind of fermentation context, but here we use them very specifically and edit their genome to do something that we want them to do. So
In many ways, because we do ferment yeast and beer and tea and kimchi, it's
kombucha. Yeah.
kombucha, which I love. I mean, these things we all bread. I mean, everyone's eating bread every day. So yeast. I mean, why has it taken us so long to get here?
Yes.
And if I can say,
That's
also
a
at the
great
side
question.
note, I mean, I'm so happy to highlight Triplebar today, but there are companies like AB InBev, largest fermenter in the world, and they're
Mhm.
starting to ferment diversified alternative proteins because they've got that technology and they've got the large vats. So why wouldn't you? So
Yeah.
why hasn't it taken us so long to get
Yeah.
here?
It's a great question, and it's actually one of the key problems that Triple Bar is trying to solve. And it's this concept of understanding metabolism. So biology is very complex, right? The study of life. And if you look at an organism, so a yeast cell has 6 billion base pairs. So that's 6 billion different
Mm,
genetic codes within its makeup. And that's a very, very small organism. That's 6 billion. And
mhm,
what scientists have been trying to do is
mhm,
understand how that cell makes things. So they'll look at different pathways within the cell, and then they'll
mhm.
try to go in and tweak different pathways on that. And that's very complicated and it takes a long time. And so what Triple Bar's approach is to take what we call a non-rational design. So the same algorithm that was used since the beginning called evolution. We can, instead of running evolution over eons, we can run evolution at hyper speed and tap into this algorithm and allow biology to solve its own problem. And we just sift through the solution that is created and find the winners. So we don't have to understand metabolism. We don't have to know what the cell is doing. We just look for, is this cell making more of the thing that we want? Folded in the right way and with the same type of efficacy that we see in nature. And so that's why we're excited to be a part of this ecosystem because we can solve that critical problem. You have to get a cell to make a protein to then scale it in AB and Bev's manufacturing plants. But that timeline is just really, really long if you use kind of the slow traditional methods that have been used. And so we're focused on accelerating that and running evolution at hyperspeed.
Is it accurate to say biology is the original AI? I
It
mean, it's
is
just so
indeed.
cool, right? It's just
It's
so
yeah.
incredibly cool that
Yes,
it's this self-fixing, self-solution oriented, um, universe in and of itself.
right.
So you say, did you say 6 billion or 6 million?
6 billion.
6 billion. So what that like just blows my mind. It just makes me think, well, 6 billion possibilities, six
That's
billion
right. That's right.
solutions
That's right.
to
Yeah.
seemingly our 6 billion problems. I mean, our list of problems only grow. So for those who look at this with a bit of skepticism, this would fall under the misunderstood term in my perspective of GMO, correct?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think the initial so I think I'd be I wouldn't want to misspeak and say that we're not like we actually do have to modify the organism to put the gene in. But then all the other techniques that a company like Triple Bar would use is what we call non-GMO methodology. So it's the
Right.
same type of things that animals, humans are exposed to in the natural environment. We're just accelerating it in a way that can get us to an outcome faster. And so, in that context, it's not GMO. So the final product that you have, a casein, let's say it's we call bovine is the science word, but casein from cows, right?
Yeah.
The final protein that comes out of that fermentation process is a cow casein, right? It's something that looks and acts just like the casein that's found from a cow. So So in that context, it's not GMO.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to, again, from a layman's perspective, just to reiterate it, because some of these concepts are
Yeah.
new for people the first time. So while you need to tweak the original gene as it goes in, once tweaked, nature does its thing. Is that correct? And
Yeah,
it
and you don't even need
proliferates.
yeah, you wanna take the same gene that is found in nature, so you're not even tweaking it, you're just putting it into an organism,
I
that's it.
see. I
So
see.
so it is the same, so it's not modified in that context. That
Hmm.
casein protein that's produced is not a modified protein.
Hmm. Yeah. And I love this also just because I love the discussion with most things. Genetically modified could be nefarious, but it isn't by definition.
That's
And
right.
so much of what we already have,
Mhm.
tomatoes in bulk out of season, that comes from a genetically modified seed. Otherwise, you'd
Right.
never be growing
Mhm.
tomatoes in bulk out of season. And yet everybody wants tomatoes in bulk out of season, and everyone eats tomatoes in bulk out of
That's
season,
right.
including those who are adamantly against GMO but
Mhm.
are eating both. So, I just want to, in
Yeah,
our world of extremes.
totally. GMO
Yeah.
is not like I think it's scary if you don't know what it is, and I think education around it is really important. And so many things that we consume and are exposed to are technically GMO or genetically modified, but just because you've modified something genetically, like we said, so you can have your tomatoes or have corn that doesn't get eaten by bad bugs, so that we actually have that corn to be produced. It's a tool that we use, and it's part of the many toolkits that we have. When I like to call we're shifting from this industrial age to what I like to call the biology age, and the age where we
Mm.
can use biology to solve problems, and I think sometimes fix some of the problems that we actually created during the industrial revolution with the impact of climate change. And so I'm excited to be a part of this biology age and embrace this toolkit that we have to really make these products in a sustainable way and on a timeline that we need so that we can feed the planet by 2050. So
And it seems that some of the reason for why we haven't been utilizing nature to its full extent, because nature here is solving the problems itself, if you will, is that we just didn't know how to harness that power. Is that
that's
correct?
I think it's that we didn't know how to harness the power, and we didn't have the tools to be able to look at
Mm.
sifting through that population of things. So if you think about 6 billion different iterations, the kind of best tools that were available several years ago were things called liquid handling robots. And so these things that like move liquids around, and they might be able to test like 100 things or maybe 1,000 of those things. Well, when you want to look at 6 billion things, you can't do that on a meaningful timeline. That would take 10 years and, hundreds of millions of dollars to actually like sift through that population. And this is one of the key things that Triple Bar wanted to solve, was to be able to actually look at that entire population of 6 million things in a single day. So we can actually sift through that population, find the winner, and then run evolution, the same cycle that evolution runs, but just do that every day instead of every 100 years or 200 years. And so that algorithm that is right in front of us can now be tapped into and accessed, and actually start to make real progress using this tool, to create food for people. So I think we're at an inflection point in the community to actually move forward in a meaningful way.
We often think of people as damaging the planet, and here, harnessing this potential of speeding up evolution, we could help nature to solve the planet's problems quickly. You had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, because we have so much to discuss on this podcast, but you had mentioned the environmental benefits, just saying obviously there are some, but maybe I'll go over some of them for people. So if
Yeah.
you are bypassing the cow altogether to get the genes for your cheese or your milk or your butter, what that means is that you don't have to deforest in the Amazon or other places, Indonesia, the US, or other places. You don't have to deforest to grow crops that have fiber and protein that you could feed to people. but we feed them to animals who need land, water, time. They need more food because they're making, we want to keep them alive for their 8 years before we slaughter them and make them hamburger. Dairy cows are hamburger cows. Before we do that, then we're going to milk them for these 8 years. That's going to take 8 years. That's
8 years.
deforesting and crops. And we could bypass all that deforestation, all of that manure that goes right into the land, right into the water, all of that waste, all of that pollution could just be bypassed, and we could go right to just getting the gene in the quantities that we want it when we need it.
That's right. And also at the price points. I think a key thing that, to be able to go through that whole process of isolating these proteins from cows, or, again, even you're talking about the 8-year process, but then you have to isolate it from the milk. And then, there's different elements of that then go away that aren't even used or discarded. And so there just isn't enough milk in the world to actually create all of the protein that's needed or could be utilized in foods that we eat because that source is limited. And so this compounds the effort, and then the price that we have to pay for those products continue to rise over the years. And this is where fermentation really can make a huge impact, because we can focus on how can we optimize that cell using biology to make more of that protein at less cost while not impacting, the environment. And so I think this is, for us, is really also a huge climate play. It's not only just can we make food that we can consume, but it's also how do we dramatically impact, access to these proteins, as well as how are we, then not using that kind of natural source to make the protein, because you don't need to anymore. You can use it through fermentation. So,
yeah, so much to unpack there. So when you do have that entire cow, you've got hooves and ears and eyes and things that, so
right.
blood, things that you're not wanting,
That's
but
right.
not just avoiding all that waste, food waste, animal waste being a big part of the emissions equation as well.
Yeah.
But now you've entered into a different conversation, which I think is so fascinating. So you've got that environmental benefit, but you've got that protein access, food justice, which is really an issue of national security.
Yes.
Getting protein to everyone on the globe and having access to that at a lower price point. So
right.
As the animals take up so much natural resources, land, water, time, that we don't have with the growing population under the pressure of climate change, you have less ability to feed the world. Now, in this equation, you have more ability to feed the world. That's equal access to proteins. That means lowering the price of proteins, while the other analog or historical way of producing proteins is getting more expensive and more expensive. You see in California, droughts that kill entire herds of cows throw up the cost of beef and also milk, et cetera. So you see here with this controlled, not so at the whim of nature, if you will, of climate change, you can control how much you produce, and you can produce enough for the entire world, driving down the cost. Now, when you drive down the cost, you increase scale. So when will we see this all take hold?
I think what's really exciting is that I think the ecosystem is coming together now to really make an impact. I think we're the food tech system. I know we know about companies like Perfect Day and Every that had established we're going to be a horizontal, or I guess a vertically integrated company. We're going to have the thing that we're going to make, and then we're going to scale it up, and then we're going to manufacture it. And then the cost of doing that and the timelines to doing that just aren't reproducible on a multiple X fold basis. And so what's been exciting to see is the food tech community shifting to more of a horizontal integration, something that's more, I think, what we see in mature industries like the semiconductor industry, where there are companies that bring specific parts of the value chain to that kind of end product, and they focus on the thing that they do best and work together as a community to create that end product, thereby almost further driving down the cost, because the cost of development go down because you have companies that do specific things there. So the key thing that we had to first start to do is, can we make organisms or cell lines or whatever we're making at the very beginning of that process that can scale? So I think that was problem one, and and that can scale to make proteins at cost points that actually are commercializable and then provide access wholly. And so I think we are entering that age now where companies like Triple Bar are impacting that very early part of the value chain. And then there's how do you take that organism, create a process around isolating that protein and then actually scaling it in the hundreds of thousands of liters that are needed to do. So what's been missing is that first bit. And now that we've got access to that first bit starting to come into the community, companies, that have large scale fermentation or companies that look to repurpose potentially large scale fermentation that's been used in other capacities can now actually be used to make these proteins. So, I always like, what is the timeline? Because I want to, in the next 3 years, I want to see products all on the shelves made from fermentation. I think we're still earlier days, to be honest. I think, I want to say, by I don't know, the next 10 years, I want to say, 90% of the food that I'm eating is coming from products that have been, made through fermentation. And I think that would be really, really exciting for us to get to that.
That would be, or that will be?
I want to say that will be.
Okay. Okay, you heard it here. The next 10 years, 90% of the food that we're eating are impacted in some way, shape, or form by precision fermentation. This to me is not a leap. And the reason this is not a leap is because we already precision ferment at food grade
That's right.
through our insulin. Insulin used to be produced through factory farms, and then realizing that would be tainted with feces or other things. It wasn't pharmaceutical grade. And so now they do precision fermentation to get people insulin. So we are all now, granted, that's a different price point,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
the technology's there and has been for a while. And then there are leaders. There's Triple Bar, of course, a leader, but then there's other big money that already knows how to do this, A, B, and B, et cetera. So what that tells me is that the foundation is there, and this snowball, once it gets started, will grow very quickly. So I don't think 10 years is far-fetched for this. It's far-fetched for cultivated meat. It's not far-fetched for precision fermentation. In my opinion, let me ask you, just to give people an understanding of the enormous efficiency. So in bypassing the cow, we bypass this very long supply chain of growing crops, cutting down trees, water, all this. But in addition, there's time. I was told a statistic, help me if I'm got this wrong, because the statistic I believe was for biomass fermentation, not precision fermentation. So let me correct myself. I understand the following for biomass fermentation, that through biomass fermentation, you can make the same amount of protein that a cow would produce in a year and a half in 3 to 4 hours.
I think that's probably accurate. Yes.
So I want people to understand not just the environmental impact, but this means the lowering of price, because you don't have to spend a year and a half spending all that money to get the same quantity that you can get in 3 hours, and what that does for food justice. So it's very, very exciting. Let me ask you, before we take a deep dive down the innovation tunnel, we've talked a lot about GMO, but not really. It's placed into a novel organism where it usually wouldn't be, but otherwise nature's doing its thing and growing at its natural pace, given the food and support you're giving it. To this end, the extension, because we started the conversation saying that you produce healthy products for people, would this be considered a clean protein, a healthy protein? How do you classify this?
Yeah, so the proteins they're kind of two categorizations, I guess. They're called bioactive proteins. So these are proteins that elicit kind of a health benefit function in the body, like gut maturation or immunity, things like that for infants. And then there are proteins that are called functional proteins. So these elicit kind of various properties that we see within a food. So this could be nutrition, it could be the stretch and feel, it could be the taste and texture of that particular protein or that particular food product. And through fermentation, those proteins it's a clean protein in the fact that it's protein. It doesn't co-purify with anything else because it's not isolated from an animal. There are proteins that are isolated from animals today that are used in products that do have some things that have to that can cause what's the phrase, the immune response. So immune reactions that people can have. So the allergies to those particular type of co-purifications. And so the nice thing about fermentation is that you don't have to worry about that because you're isolating just that very specific protein and then consuming it as it is. So from that context, I would say, yes, it's a clean protein, not only just on what it is, it's just the protein, but it also doesn't have all this other stuff that could potentially be attached to it. So,
Okay. So again, deep dive just for everyone to understand. Let's do like a list. Has not.
okay.
Growth hormones and antibiotics. That would be a
Has not.
no. Has
No.
not. Saturated fat because it's an animal.
Has not.
Has not.
Yeah,
Has not. The saturated fat would come when you take the casein and you add fat to make cheese. So
that's right.
that's on you, people.
That's
Okay.
right. That's
It's
right.
on you. Okay. Uh, the same profile as an animal protein. So for people who want protein, very good. If you're worried about inflammation in the body or something, it's going to have the same profile that an animal protein would be, which some people don't want. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I would say that's right. So I mean, I think it's I think the a lot of those kind of reactions to animal proteins are due to these kind of I don't know, I call them hitchhikers for lack of a non-scientific word that
Mhm.
are with that protein that then cause that reactivity or that inflammation. And so this is an opportunity to make those proteins so they don't purify with those kind of hitchhiker things. And but if you want to avoid animal proteins altogether, then this is probably not your path
Yes,
down.
this is probably not your path. Now, most people really want animal proteins, but my understanding is there is some inflammation in the body for that, et cetera. And you're probably still going to have cholesterol with an animal protein, right? Or
I
would
don't
that
think
be considered a hitchhiker?
that would be one of those hitchhikers.
So then it just depends on the product you make with it.
That's right. Yeah. It's the where is that protein put in? What are all the other
I
things that
see.
go into that particular food that you're eating? So we're
Mhm.
making protein ingredients that go into a final product,
Of
and
course.
all the other elements around that, could have other things. So that's why it's important to read labels and know where your food's coming from. So
And know your science. Oh my
I know
God, and I've already tripped up quite a bit here. No, thanks for that. That really helps me to understand. You're right. It's just the protein itself. There's no cholesterol, there's no saturated fat. Then it depends on what you do with it, which brings me to my next question of innovation. Well, actually, before hold that thought before I get to innovation, I'll just say we at VegTech Invest, my listeners know this, really believe in the financial viability of the supply chain and
Yes.
building out that infrastructure. And we really see this as a growth and investment property. So those listening today might imagine that you're avoiding using the animal. And so maybe now they can drink milk again because it doesn't involve animal cruelty, factory farms, these kinds of things.
Mhm, mhm.
But it's also that the dairy companies might use this. I mean, you're not limited to one sector of who's going to use your ingredient. So
That's
your
right.
ingredient can go to meat companies, dairy companies, Frito-Lay, if you want to make corn chips that have protein,
Yeah. No,
right?
that's
So if Fritos now become like a protein delivery system. I don't know.
No, that's right, that's right, and we're focused on 2 areas of protein and animal, at Triplebar, and they're both, animal protein, so there's these bioactive functional proteins, but we also do focus on cultivated meat, because we do believe there's a path, to meat without the animal, and I think that's um, but it all goes back to that single cell, so, animal cells like to grow in animals, not in large fermentation bioreactor tanks. And so we have to use that same property or that same algorithm of evolution to evolve those cells in a non-GMO way, to have the properties that they needed to grow in tanks. So they need to be able to float. They need to be tolerant to their own waste products. There's no kidneys in tanks, right? So they have to have these particular properties. They have to grow fast. Animal cells don't grow very fast because obviously we would like unless you're growing like lots of muscle, we all know how hard it is to build muscle by working out and you're consuming all these proteins. The same thing with animal cells in a in a little flask. So and so we think that there's an impact here to have those animal cells not having kind of those hitchhikers as well with the cholesterol. They're not exposed to all the environmental things because they're literally grown in a bioreactor. So we know what goes into that process to make those proteins, and it's the same thing with fermentation. We know the ingredients that go into that process to make those proteins. So yeah.
A little bit of an esoteric tangent, but you said, there are hitchhiker elements to your protein that might say like, hey, we'll take your protein and make a really saturated, fat, smelly cheese. And most people will be over the moon and they'll eat that smelly cheese and not think twice about it. So
Yeah.
there's those hitchhiker things. But then there's also other hitchhikers in that imagine if you're not using the animal, so you don't need to deforest, so you don't need to grow all those crops, use all that water, use all that land.
Mhm.
What entrepreneurial mindset have you unlocked by freeing up this land? What else will we do with the land that could better humanity? I mean, the tail is really long about the savings by mitigating our resources. So
Mhm.
if you don't use these colossal resources for animal agriculture, 77% of our agricultural land is used to graze animals and grow crops for animals. It gives
Mhm.
us 18% of our calories because
Mhm.
animals are long, inefficient calorie converters. So you
Sure.
put a lot in, you get very little back. If
Mhm.
you get rid of that bad math, now you've got all this land. What will the engineer or the scientist or the business entrepreneur do with all those added resources to benefit society? So there's just an opening of an innovation box. So this leads me to what kind of innovation, that's a bit esoteric, but for your world of innovation, what kind of, will we see a Frito corn chip now carrying protein? What will we see with this product?
I mean, potentially. I think what innovation really brings with the ability to make proteins through fermentation and bioreactors is really co-locating the food production to its actual spot. So we know, so
Hmm.
let's say like Singapore, for example, they have this 30 by 30 goal to make 30% of their protein or food that they have actually in the country of Singapore. I think it's a goal that I'm not sure they're going to quite reach, but I love the initiative around it, and their government efforts have been really working towards that outcome. And so instead of planting crops, we're going to have kind of tanks of reactors that are actually making food and purifying it and using a lot of the technologies that are used now to make food proteins. But we're just going to do that kind of on site. And so this is why part of the process of fermentation is to also make sure that we're growing these organisms, or in the case of cultivated meat, growing these cell lines in low cost, food, right? We call that media for cells. So low cost media that don't require all these big inputs of components that require corn to be farmed and then harvested and then make
Mhm.
sugar and do of all that. We want to work through a process to where that cell is like super robust and doesn't need all of that. And so I think that the future is really the co-location of food production where it's needed, versus kind of import, export, shipping. We saw even because of the war in Ukraine, right? 10% of the world's wheat is exported from Ukraine, and that's a problem when there's a war that's happening there. And so, how can we impact global famine? How can we actually, create food where it's being consumed? I think that's a really cool innovation that fermentation and cultivated meat at large really impact for us for sure.
Yeah, again, so much to unpack there. I think that's very cool from a food security standpoint,
That's right.
is that you will not be so dependent on your neighbor with whom you may get along or you may not, as we see Ukraine
Yes.
and
Yes.
Russia or the US and China. You see these things where if you can have local food, you then don't have worldwide transportation of live and dead animals. Australia ships live sheep to the Middle East. We
Right.
ship live pigs, many arrive dead to China. Just the absurdity of
Okay.
so I'm starting to have all these energy conversations with Bloomberg Intelligence and others about the overlap, the energy savings that happen when you innovate in the food industry. and
That's
what an important impact that is for, again, the environmental conversation, the climate conversation.
right.
So I just think that the tail that comes from this critical innovation is very, very long
Yeah.
of what things we can positively impact. Meanwhile, again, just to hit it over the head, those who are critical of GMOs, soy is often genetically modified. And if you are eating animals, you are eating soy, because animals make up 70 to 80% of all the soy consumption in the world. So the same goes with corn. If you're eating corn, you are already having a genetically modified product. So just be aware that it can be nefarious. It can also be quite good and relevant. And we're not even talking about something genetically modified here. We're just talking about letting evolution take velocity by giving it a new home.
That's right. I like that.
Okay.
I like velocity. That's a good word.
But we talked about, your customers may be the plant-based innovation community. I use that term meaning these novel innovations that are replacing animals with efficiency. So that could be precision fermentation or cultivated meat as they use sugars in the media, or it could just be straight plant-based proteins. But that innovation umbrella, so all of these innovations and their supply chains, plant-based innovation companies might be your clients, but meat and dairy might be your clients. And I'm wondering what kind of reaction you've had from that sector.
Yeah. What's been really exciting is that it's kind of across all the different sectors. And so, we one of our public partnerships that we talk about is with Friesland Campina Ingredients out of the Netherlands. So kind of the third largest dairy ingredient producer in the world. And we're working with them on bioactive proteins. And so, they currently isolate proteins from cow's milk, and there isn't enough supply to be able to make all these proteins. And so a 150-year-old dairy company is innovating to use fermentation to create proteins. And that's really exciting to me, that we're seeing this shift of incumbents to thinking about new ways of innovation on how we can actually increase the access of these very valuable, nutritious proteins throughout the world and at cost points that people can afford. And so, I think there's there was, I forget the name of the company, but one cultivated meat company used a phrase called complementary protein. And I really like that phrase, because I think, you can become very polarizing if you're like, well, we're going to just do away with all of that. And I don't think that's a reasonable kind of starting point. I think we have to say there's an option to move in the direction of, where are you as a consumer, making buying choices about the things that you're eating. And maybe today, 90% of the protein that you consume isn't available to you by fermentation. But if you start making, conscious choices, and we as a humanity can make those conscious choices of accessing that, protein, maybe start at 10%, maybe then it goes to 20%. And then by the time, we are at this 90% goal or more, where food is being changed and produced. So it's kind of right now I see it very much as a complementary protein, but also then giving access to people that don't even have access to these proteins because it's not affordable, right? And so I think there's really kind of two plays that proteins through fermentation or cultivated meat really can impact the community. So.
Yeah, there's so much to wrap our minds around here. I mean, I think you've made so many arguments for why this makes logical sense. In a world where we have dwindling resources and a growing population, and therefore a food supply system that no longer can feed all of its people. This makes great sense. And then it also makes dollars and cents as we look to bring down the cost of proteins and be more efficient and have shorter supply chains and lower costs of goods sold. And I love the phrase complementary protein. I've been using diversified proteins because I'm in the investment world, investing in this sector in the public markets. And when you have an investment portfolio, you look to a diversified portfolio to mitigate risk and have many options. Well, why wouldn't we want the same thing in the food supply chain, specifically coming out of COVID, where we saw that it didn't work? And then again, we were reminded that it didn't work with the Ukraine-Russian war. So and the like some of the fallout of that war is India stopped exporting wheat because it got very protective of the wheat that it had for its own people, and was, so you see very quickly how the food supply chain falls apart and its need for diversification, for risk management. But I like this idea of complementary. It just says like we play nicely together.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, there's a world for all of this, and I think consumers will have an opportunity to make more informed decisions about kind of where they source their food from, and I think there's obviously different kind of socioeconomic situations throughout the world, but I think companies that are committed to providing access to these proteins worldwide, Friesland Campina is a great example of that. I think that's where we can really start to see the impact.
And I'll say from a business standpoint, that's the smart competitor.
Yeah.
The competitor that is not entrenched in the political this way or that way, but just says, I'm here to make money on producing protein.
That's right.
And those will be the winners in the business equation. I'm curious, this Friesland Campina, could you say their name again?
Friesland Campina.
Friesland Campina, thanks for that. Did they initially come to you with an environmental benefit in mind or cost benefit? Or what drove them initially to find you?
Yeah. So it was kind of a combination of two things. I would say one, we kind of found each other. So, they'd been making, and we can publicly talk about the one of the main proteins, because we did a press release on it, called lactoferrin. And so lactoferrin is a protein that is used in kind of high-end infant formulas. It's also sometimes used in adult supplementation. But it's very expensive to make as isolated through cow's milk. And so, they wanted, basically their customers were coming to them because they supply the ingredient. They also have some end market products as well in infant formula. But they were, saying, we want more of this. And then they were saying, well, we can't make enough of it at cost points that can be broadly incorporated into things like infant formula. And so they were motivated by how can we have access to this protein more broadly and not just have it in premium infant formulas, but in all kinds of infant formulas. And then also, why can't we make this in adult supplements? So there's all kinds of access that these proteins can be made. And so they're like, but we don't know how to do fermentation from an organism standpoint. We ferment a lot of other things, but we don't know how to make an organism that can make these proteins. And this is where Triplebar comes into play. And a lot of times here's the other thing that is not talked about as much, is that these proteins are actually pretty hard to make in fermentation. And so this is why using biology and allowing biology to solve that problem for itself and finding the solution kind of after the fact is really important in this process, because they're not easy. They're not straightforward to make a lot of it at quantities that are, what we say cost parity. So at the same price as the proteins that are isolated from natural sources. Cost parity is kind of the starting point, but that doesn't get you broad market access or broad product incorporation. You really have to get those price points down. And that's really where the partnership with Triplebar and Friesland, really come together to solve kind of both of those main problems. So.
And communicating with the consumer. So
Yes.
while this isn't as outlandish or freaky as all that, you have to get past the terminology.
Yes.
So if the terminology is unfamiliar to you and you don't have more time than what a soundbite will allow, and as we know, boy, talking about nefarious, I mean, the media can be nefarious or it can be educational.
Mm-hmm.
It's anyone's guess as to what it really is at this point. So, the Friesland Campina can help with that education process to the consumer to let them know, hey, if you're a diabetic, you're already using this kind of product. Like it's all, this isn't really that foreign. It's just smart and using the ability that we've had for a while in a different way so that we can harness the power of velocity, really is how I see it. So very interesting times ahead, but I appreciate that you shared with us a challenge, because I didn't want the listeners to leave thinking it was like going to happen tomorrow. There are some challenges, and that is that the protein is actually difficult to make and difficult to make at scale.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think that's where the community has to come together with their key innovation points along the value chain to really then be able to solve those problems along that journey. And then I think as we think about the future of proteins, we talked about a couple of very specific ones, but I think there's other opportunities for us to use kind of the same types of technologies like fermentation, even for, let's say, ag biologicals. If we want to create kind of a very safe version of a pesticide that only kills the bad bug and doesn't kill all the other good bugs, that's another application of fermentation that we don't even talk about today. That really could be kind of exciting. And so I think there's a lot of other food, climate, ag impact that fermentation can bring in the future, and we're excited to be a part of all of it. So
Yeah, it's a very long entrepreneurial tale
it
that
is.
this innovation could inspire.
Yeah,
But I'll just do a very big shout out to the Biden administration. It doesn't happen without cash and
that's right.
grants. And you
That's
need
right.
to start investing in food tech like you invest in climate tech.
Right.
Otherwise, we're going to be in the back of the bus on food. That's a national security issue as well as climate issues. So speed it up and start spending.
Yep.
Okay, that's how I leave you, except I'll also say I've tried Strive milk. Have you ever tried it?
I have not actually.
So I'm going to do a shout out to everybody. Just go on Amazon, Strive milk. I believe it's Strive, or maybe Stryve, but they are doing a milk with precision fermentation. And so if you'd like to try this technology and see what it's like in your refrigerator, just go on Amazon, buy it. It's here, folks. It's here. It's here, and it's no really more expensive than anything else. So let me know your thoughts. Come find me on LinkedIn. You can always leave your comments. Maria Cho, before I let you go, I have 3 really fast personal questions that you can
All
answer.
right.
Try to get them in one sentence or not. Well, one sentence, please. What do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
The power of leveraging your network and working
Mm,
together as a community.
mm. Is that
Mhm.
possible?
It can happen.
Okay, okay. Thank you. As we roll into an election. Okay, thank you. It is possible. It is possible. Okay. You're running around. It's a crazy day. Maybe it's not going the way you would like. What is a phrase you tell yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
Setting limits for yourself only lets other people be in control of your potential.
I'm going to incorporate that immediately. Say it again.
Setting limits for yourself only lets other people be in control of your potential.
Yeah. I totally agree. Totally agree. Oh, that needs a t-shirt right now. That's wonderful. That's so cool. Okay, it's the same day. You're running around. This time, it's so crazy you don't have time for lunch. What's your go-to snack?
I love a vegan protein shake. It's actually called the Owyn, OWYN. Shout out for their protein shakes. Probably one of the best ones that I've had.
I've never tried them, but I've seen them
They're
at
really
trade shows, etc., and they're good, huh?
really good. They're really
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Putting it on the list, putting it on the list. Maria Cho, I want to thank you for the knowledge drop that you've shared with us. It's so very inspirational, so very exciting. We are living in chaotic, but very interesting times, very exciting times, very hopeful times. I mean, change is going to happen in a major way in our lifetimes. Maria's saying 10 years, everybody, 10 years, that 90% of what we consume will be with the help of fermentation, specifically precision fermentation, biology unleashed, if you will, for good. So I am so happy, Maria, that you're here. I hope that you'll come back and keep us updated on your progress.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for impacting this community in a positive way. And looking forward to having a meal with that precision fermentation protein with you.
Oh, that's so awesome. I am the same. Maria, don't go away. Everybody else on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. I will see you all next week from Chicago. Bye, everybody. Stay put, Maria.